A very long body on it.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome to this event on the state of trusts, facts and democracy. I'm Bobby Duffy. I'm Director of the Policy Institute here at King's, and I'll be chairing this really very timely event. In this slightly weird or maybe fitting surroundings of an anatomy lecture theatre, there actually was an anatomy lecture theatre. We were just finding out, I think, that this was the bit where the dissections actually happened. It was a long time ago. In fact, the last dissection that was carried out here was coincidentally in May 1997, which, for those who can remember that far back, was a very different political time in the UK. It was probably a more optimistic time, not for the person who was being dissected, obviously, at that time, but more optimistic time for us, 170 majority for the party that had just come into power here. And as we'll see from Michael Dimmock in a second, trust was on the up in the US in that period. Very different from now. So we'll be mainly focusing on a presentation from Mike Dimmock. Mike is a president of Pew Research Center, a non-partisan fact tank that informs the public about the issues, attitudes, and trends shaping America and the world. And he'll be drawing on this excellent work, Pew's excellent work in this area, in his presentation focusing on the US. So after the presentation from Mike, I'll invite up our brilliant panel who are sitting down here at the front so they can see the slides. And they'll focus on putting that excellent insight and data into a UK and European context. We have Dr. Sarah Heyman, from Associate Professor in European Politics at the LSE, and she's published extensively on European affairs, in particular on transparency and accountability in political systems, so very relevant for tonight. Then we'll have Paula Surridge, who's Senior Lecturer at the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies at the University of Bristol. And Paula is particularly interested in social and political values, including their impact on political behaviours. And then finally, we'll have Matthew Taylor, who's Chief Executive of the RSA since 2006. Prior to that, Matthew was Chief Advisor on Political Strategy to the PM at the time, and of course presents the really excellent Polarized podcast, which I can heartily recommend to people. So first up, we will have Mike. Panel will join us. They'll do a few minutes each. Then we'll have questions from you, and we will be wrapped up by 7:45 before drinks next door. So, Michael Dimmock, very welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Bobby. This was a real opportunity to connect research we've been doing in the US and other parts of the world with some really great research tonight. I'm going to try to move through my presentation fairly quickly if I'm talking fast, only because I think there's a lot that I'd like us to be able to talk about in terms of connecting the dots. And if you haven't seen this great report out of the Policy Institute here about divided Britain, I recommend it. It gives you a lot of perspective on all of this as well. So I'm Michael Dimmock. I'm president of the Pew Research Center. Just a little bit about us. We are a nonpartisan, non-issue advocacy organization in the US. We simply are designed to generate a foundation of facts that enriches the public dialogue and supports sound decision making. That means we don't offer policy solutions. We describe ourselves as a fact tank rather than a think tank or a do tank, because we're trying to create the ground level information that everybody can trust, and then they can turn it into policy solutions. This work I want to talk about with you today is going to focus on the US. We've been doing work around the world on issues related to this, and it's part of a broader initiative we have called Trust, Facts, and Democracy, just because it seems as we look at issues around the world that some of the foundations of democracy seem to be coming into question in ways that they weren't in the 1990s or even the first part of this century. And I want to focus my talk today around three general themes: trust, tribes, and technology. I tended to try not to use the term tribes for a long time because I think it's very evocative. But in terms of describing the American partisan political landscape, I think there's a lot of truth to it, and we can talk about that in a little bit. Let me jump right in and talk about trust. One of the core slides in the US that we've looked at for a long time is the trend in public trust in the federal government in Washington. This is one of the oldest survey questions in American polling history. I'm a pollster by training, so it's one of the things I learned early on. It started in 1957, and they designed the question to say, how often would you say you trust the federal government in Washington to do what is right? All of the time, most of the time, or only some of the time. They stopped there because nobody was really that low on the scale at that point. They didn't give a never. Today, a whole lot of people volunteer never, if you ask the question this way. But you can see that it was quite high in the 1950s. And there's a whole lot you can learn about American history and the ebbs and flows of public confidence in the federal government. But the period I want to focus on today is this kind of current new normal of deep distrust in the federal government in Washington. You can see that it had gotten that low at other periods, post-Watergate in the early 90s, but now we've been stuck in this trench for a long, long time. And before sort of overthinking that, it's important to understand what it's not in American politics right now. There are a few things that people often think this is about that it really isn't. One of them is ideology. This is not an ideological turn against the role of government in society. Americans, on average, tend to be a bit conservative about what they want their government to do, but that hasn't changed in a really fundamental way over this period of time. There's a question we've asked, and it also has a long, long history in American politics, that says, all in all, would you prefer a bigger government that provides more services or a smaller government that provides fewer services? And the balance of opinion of that is typically around 50-50 in America. It's moved at different points in time, but right now that's not really off the scale. The most recent trend we had is 48 bigger, 45 smaller. It really isn't that different. So the distrust in government or the disengagement with government is not about a turn against government playing a role in society. It's also not connected to deficits and debt. At other periods in time, some of the frustration with the federal government in Washington was that it was just overspending and that it was sort of, cut loose from the reality of finances. Arguably it is today. American debt is going up and up and up, but the public concern about American debt is actually going down and down and down in polling. It's not a really front of mind issue in the American electorate, and it's not what is driving this period of distrust in government. It's not about the delivery of services by the federal government. In fact, most agencies of the US federal government get pretty good marks from the American public for doing their jobs pretty well. That's not just the perennially popular parts of government like the Park Service or the Postal Service. Even departments that are involved in regulation and big spending get pretty good marks from the American public. The Health and Human Services, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Food and Drug Administration, they're all involved in big important issues, and they're all generally getting good marks. Even the IRS, the tax man in the US, gets more positive than negative ratings from the public for how it's doing its job today. So this trend I'm showing you is not about a distrust in the ability of professionals in government to do their jobs. In fact, we asked people about 12 different areas of government performance, jobs that the government does, from food safety to education to helping people get out of poverty. And majority said they saw a major role for government in all of those areas, and in 10 out of 13 areas, the government got good marks for delivering on a lot of those issues, again, at the action level. In fact, one of the exceptions was dealing with immigration, where only 28% said we were doing a good job, which kind of gives you a sense of why that's become a big issue in the US these days. So the core anxiety is not about what the government should do or its ability to perform. It's connected to other issues. It's also not about state and local government in the US. Those have remained very regarded highly. The focus of this distrust in the US is really around the elected officials in Washington. And we'll put Trump in his own special category for a second. This is predominantly about Congress. And in some ways, these are perennial concerns. People think members of Congress lose touch with the public, that they're looking out for their own careers. These are kind of perennial concerns that have heightened over the last few years. We're seeing a lot more frustration from publics about accountability in Washington, that members of Congress are not held to account when they do wrong or when they violate the public trust in some ways. That's a deep thing. You'll see a slide in a moment that points that out. So the dislike and focus of this is around the elected officials in Washington. The roots of that are a growing American unease with the effectiveness of our electoral system itself. for selecting those officials in Washington. And then what I'll point out is sort of a broader, what I describe as a democratic deficit, a sense of what we need to have a healthy democracy in our country and where that's really lacking in the public's mind these days. Let me give you just a few examples. When you think about elected officials in Washington, as I said, people have a plenty of negative things to say. One slide that I think kind of captures it at this moment is people are really skeptical about what they see and hear in social media. I'll show another slide later that shows that people have, I think, arguably a healthy skepticism about information they get on social media, but it pales in comparison to how hard they feel it is to tell what's true and not true listening to elected officials, right? The sense that you can't tell what's true and not true coming from elected officials is really strong right now. A lot of that goes to these doubts about the effectiveness of the electoral system in America. Some of that is about money, and America has a uniquely complicated relationship between free speech and money and American elections. There are a lot of ways in which that issue has only heightened over the last couple of decades as various court cases and other decisions and other organizations have come up along those lines. Most of the American public is not aware of all of those details. They couldn't tell you about those court cases. They couldn't tell you about what the rules of the road are. But they do have a growing sense that money is affecting our electoral process in negative ways. Not just the corruption element of it. I mean, that's an important issue. There's a sense that people feel that their elected officials are potentially beholden to interests related to money. They also feel that it's distorting the overall public voice, not allowing certain voices to be heard and recognized. There's also a really interesting thread in this, which is that the public believes that the best possible candidates for elected office aren't surfacing because money has a way, it freezes out candidates from even putting their hat in the ring or being eligible for getting past that threshold of having money in order to run an effective campaign in America. And that's not just about presidential elections. Again, that's a special class of American politics. To run for Congress, to run for a statewide office, you're talking about multi-million-dollar campaigns now. The cost of running elections in America is massive, and it's become something that's front of mind even more than in the past in the American way they're looking at it. But beyond money, it's about some of the other mechanisms of American politics that have been getting increasing attention. Redistricting and gerrymandering, as we call it, the sense that, again, the public doesn't know all the rules of the road and how that's in fact done, but they've seen plenty of pictures of these distorted districts to have a feeling that the way their voice is expressed is being distorted and manipulated for political gain in one way or another, and that leads to that kind of distrust. They also have growing concerns about our elections being hacked even, right? That before 2018, 55% said that they thought our election system was either not too or not at all secure from possible hacking. So you have a plethora of reasons, even the anxieties around how our electoral college works in presidential elections, that has made people mistrustful of how the electoral process operates. So when I talked about this democratic deficit, this is a set of questions that we ask that goes beyond elections, but it's looking at a variety of factors in American politics. We asked 23 different questions about what a good democracy needs. And on 23 out of 23 of them, people said, oh yes, this is very important. For our democracy to function well, this is very important to have. Only in 8 out of the 23 did a majority even say we were doing fairly well on that issue in our country. So we've even tipped the scales a little. Very important versus very or fairly well on each of these issues. So one of the biggest ones, in fact, the single biggest divide or deficit in American politics is around polarization, which I'll get to in a second. 78% saying that it's very important that Republicans and Democrats work together on issues for our democracy to function well, and only 19% saying that this describes our country even fairly well today. Maybe an obvious one. The second biggest gap or deficit was over accountability. 83% saying it's very important that elected officials face serious consequences for misconduct, only 30% saying that even describes our country fairly well. So a huge deficit in what they think is critical to the election. An interesting one in our context is there's a belief among American public that it's very important to have news organizations that don't favor political parties, and only 30% saying that describes our country even fairly well. And then And when I talk about this deeper deficit and discomfort with our elections, it's not just about the process, it's about the people themselves. 78% say it's very important for our democracy that voters are knowledgeable, and only 39% saying that describes our electorate even fairly well right now. There's a deep, deep unease about the ability of the American public to make informed decisions in elections. And this is a fairly new thing in our polling. This is a different survey question on the same topic. We started this question in 1997. How confident are you in the wisdom of the American people in making political decisions? Very confident, somewhat confident, not at all confident. We've collapsed that into 64% very or somewhat confident in 1997. That actually inverted in 2015. So this is before the 2016 election. We saw this complete overturning of that balance of opinion. Instead of 2-to-1 confident, we had 2-to-1 not confident in the wisdom of the American people in making political decisions. It improved slightly after the 2016 election, interestingly, because Republicans became more confident after 2016 in the wisdom of the American people, but that has dropped off a bit since. I think the bigger picture of this is not about the particulars of an election cycle, but a deeper sense of discomfort that the American public is up to the act of making these decisions. And that gets really to the root of how democracy functions and your confidence in a democracy. There are a couple big factors behind that, and this is a good moment to turn over to the political polarization story in the US, because a big part of that is a mistrust of our fellow citizens based on partisan polarization and a sense of distance from others in our society. There are a lot of ways to think about political polarization in the US. One picture that we've drawn over the years that I think gives you some sense of it, but again, you can misread it fairly easily, is what we call a values divide in American politics. So this chart is showing you the distribution of Democrats and Republicans on a scale where the left edge of the scale means you take the Democratic position on 10 out of 10 different value items that we're asking. Questions about the value of immigrants to our society, or whether homosexuality should be accepted, or the role of government in our society, a wide range of issues, environmental issues. It covers a whole spectrum of different issues. And to be on the left edge of one of these charts, you had to take the more democratic position on all 10 of those issues. And to be on the right edge of this chart, you'd have to take the Republican position on all 10 of those issues. And you can see that in 1994, even in 2004, yeah, Democrats on average were a little more likely in the electorate to take Democratic positions, but they were hardly uniform, right? Very few Democrats were 10 out of 10 on Democratic issues. In fact, the typical Democrat in America would agree with the Democratic Party really on maybe 6, maybe 7 of those items, and agree with the Republican Party on the other 3 or 4. There was a lot of cross-cutting issues in American politics. There was not a lot of uniformity in the way people connected across multiple issues, which again, maybe arguably makes sense, right? There's no intrinsic connection between your views on the environment and your views on acceptance of homosexuality, et cetera. You know, why would all those things be aligned? Well, but that's what we've seen in about the last decade and a half, is this increasing kind of consistency across issues. Some analysts call this political sorting, right? We're kind of sorting out more in a way where we see all issues in that democratic lens. Some of it is sort of just the psychology of it. People are picking up more on those partisan cues, and on issues where they may have had a soft initial preference, siding with their party more and more on those issues. But what you're seeing now is that a typical Democrat probably agrees with their party on 8 or maybe even 9 out of those 10 issues, rather than 6 or 7 back to 25 years ago. Now, this is another way of looking at that same data, which is across those 10 different items that we've asked consistently over this time period, what is the average difference on each individual question between Democrats, Republicans, between whites, non-whites, between high religion, low religion Americans, between high education, low education, older, younger, men, women. So we're looking at a variety of different traditional cleavages in American society and tracking the size of the gap over time. And to me, this is a really important slide because it's showing that the fissure over partisanship is the one that's growing, right? America is no more divided in its values by race, by gender, by religion, by education. Those are meaningful divides, and on certain items, they're very big divides. But the scale of those divides in American politics haven't grown over this time period. It's this convergence of party across all of these issues that's really the defining feature. Now, again, what are these things not saying? It's important to not misread these charts. This doesn't mean that Americans are more extreme in their views on all of these issues, right? This is really just looking at how many issues line up through that partisan lens, right? It doesn't mean that people hold more extreme views on the environment or more extreme views on tax policy. It just means that they're more likely to have those views correlated and aligned and connected with their partisan identification. It also doesn't mean that the country is intrinsically more divided today than it was in the past. And when I talk to audiences in the US that are old enough to have lived through the 60s and early 70s, that's one of the first things they say. I've seen this country more divided, right? What's unique about this period is not the depth of divides over key issues like then the Vietnam War and civil rights, today maybe immigration or other issues. The depth of those divides isn't necessarily deeper. It's just that they're all aligning along this singular dimension of party. And so what's behind or what is going on with that polarization and how deep does it run? I do think of it sometimes as magnetic, right? It seems to have this force that everything's kind of collapsing around. A new issue arises and it sort of very quickly becomes a partisan issue. Issues that used to not be partisan, like the environment and immigration, have collapsed into this partisan dimension. Some of it is about political leaders. There's a deep mistrust of political leaders in politics, and people's views of the other political party have grown increasingly negative. Partisanship in the US is almost entirely what political scientists call negative partisanship. It's not a sense that your team is great. In fact, very few Americans think their party is great. Very few Democrats think the Democratic Party is fabulous, and the same on the other side. It's that they see the other party in more extremely negative terms, see the parties not just as the loyal opposition, but an operation and a group of people who, if given control of government, would really ruin the country, right? It's really seen in dire and extreme terms, and that negativity is really what defines it. It's not positive views of your own side. So when Democrats think of Mitch McConnell, when Republicans think of Nancy Pelosi, these are people who are just downright scary in terms of what they mean for our country and what could happen. But it runs deeper than just how people are looking at the political leaders. Partisanship has become really a social identity in America in ways that are sort of creeping into the way people interact at a social level and the way people see others at the citizen level, not just at the political leader level. Some of the stereotypes that people have of people who are from the other political party really are the kinds of stereotypes that we think of that often might be associated with things like race or ethnicity or gender, that people are attributing traits to people of the other political party, negative traits typically, that are very much about characterizations of somebody at a very deep personal level. The sense, Republicans tend to view Democrats as lazy and judgmental, kind of really old, kind of psych profile measures. Democrats see Republicans as closed-minded and irrational. There's a deep level of distrust, a sense that talking about politics, which has always been touchy, is now a third rail, a sense that your ability to connect with somebody, maybe one of the questions is if somebody moved into your neighborhood and they were a Republican or a Democrat, would it be hard to make friends with them, easy to make friends with them? This sense that, well, if they're a Republican, I won't agree with them on anything, right? We're a mile apart, right? There's no common ground with those with somebody, and how could they support those political leaders? Another big factor in this is there's a shared sense of kind of political aggrievement or loss on both sides of the aisle. Basically, both Democrats and Republicans in America feel like they're losing right now. And when you feel like you're losing ground, you really want to dig in, right? And you really want your political leaders to dig in. And that's a very big part of the American political dynamic right now. If you ask Democrats, the question we ask is, all in all, in politics today, is the side you agree with. We don't even use partisan labels. Winning more often than it's losing, or losing more often than it's winning. And both sides feel like they're losing. It tips a little bit when Trump became president. You know, the Republicans felt a bit better than they did under Obama, and vice versa. But still, there's this sense that we're losing ground. It really came to the surface in Supreme Court nominations in the US. You saw that before the 2016 election with the standoff over that. It's because when you ask Republicans, they feel like our court has moved to the left, and they need to hold their ground and not let that happen. But if you ask Democrats looking at the same court, they think the court had already moved to the right, and they wanted their political leaders to stand their ground and not let that happen anymore. So this signal that the electorate's sending to their elected officials is very much from this position of loss, this position that we've already given up too much ground to the other side. Now, I haven't talked a lot about Trump yet because most of these trends started before Trump even was a candidate, right? And those long historical trends are part of it. But Trump really was a factor in all of this. And I think there's an angle in this that he really accentuated and has accelerated, arguably, you know, both during the election and since. And one of the questions on a survey we did this summer kind of clicked on this, and it's resonated with a lot of people we've talked to in the US. We were asking about the nature of discourse in America, what people thought was working, how easy it is to talk with friends and neighbors, what you think about discourse in Washington. And we asked about a lot of different groups and said, well, how has so-and-so or this group or that group affected the tone and nature of debate in America, for the better, for the worse, or has this person not really had much effect? And when we asked about Donald Trump, maybe not surprisingly, 55% said they felt that he has made the tone and nature of debate in America worse. You know, he tends to be a pretty bold talker, says a lot of things that get people worked up. And so but when most people looked at this, they focused on that blue area and said, wow, a quarter of Americans think he's improved the tone and nature of debate in our country, made it better, right? What does that mean, right? In what way has he improved the nature of our dialogue? And that's about half of Republicans. And what Trump has really, you know, inspired and connected with is a sense among many Republicans in America that goes beyond the our side is winning and losing in the political battlefield, the policy battlefield, to this deeper sense that their voices have been stifled in the American conversation by a cultural elite, media, cultural institutions, governments, universities, etc., that are telling us what's okay and not okay to say in our society today. And when Trump transgresses that language, when he says things that you aren't allowed to say, it's whether you agree or disagree with the particulars of what he said at that moment, it really taps into that deep level of frustration. And I think that's a lot of what people are expressing here when they say he's improved the tone and nature of our discourse. You saw this in a question we were asking back during the 2016 election that was one of the biggest divides between Trump voters and Clinton voters. There are a lot of ways to ask about the discourse around inclusion versus political correctness. This was one version of it that we did. Which comes closer to your view? People need to be more careful with the language they use to avoid offending others, or too many people are easily offended these days over language. There are a lot of ways you can word this, but in this question, it was about 60-40 on the too easily offended. But you can see that was almost universal among Trump supporters, this sense of concern about how language was being silenced and that people were taking offense too easily. So you almost have these two cultures now in America. We took some caricatured American bumper stickers, you know, with a hybrid car and a pickup truck. But I think there's a reality to those caricatures, and they're sitting in people's minds in the American electorate. And for those of you who watched the 2016 election, you know that there was a lot of conversation about the education divide in the vote. White non-college grad voters was one of the most commonly referred to groups. I want to just make sure that everybody knows that's new to the American political kind of environment. That's not the norm. This is showing the balance of the vote in elections from 80 through 16, and the basic takeaway is that there really wasn't much of a partisan gap, much of an education gap in the balance of the vote. Basically, college grads in the darker line and those who didn't finish a college degree in the lighter line were voting about the same in each of those elections. They both voted for Reagan in the 80s, they both voted for Clinton in the 90s. There are little gaps here and there, but it wasn't really a major divide in American politics until now, right? And we had the college grads voting for Clinton by 9 points and the non-college grads voting for Trump by 8 points. And if you filter that down to just white voters, you see an even bigger divide on that front. So this is a kind of new, I put it in quotes, class divide. Class can mean a lot of things. What it means in the US is really complicated. But clearly it's around this education divide that really has expanded under Trump. It persisted into the 2018 midterms. I think one of the questions for American politics is this a new sort of realignment and divide in the American electorate where Trump has tapped into an existing divide in the American population and collapsed it into that partisan division. Let me just breeze technology super fast just because I want to get to the conversation. The main takeaway is, yes, the web is growing as a source of news for Americans. TV is still the top. It's the dominant source of news for younger generations, and this data is even from a couple of years ago. It's moving fast. This is only a one-year change in these charts. That mobile is becoming a predominant device. Notice this is how often do you get news on, and 45% on a mobile device, and over 31% saying they often get news on a mobile device. So this is becoming the pathway to news. Social media is a huge part of that, about 2/3 saying they get news over social media. There's a lot of skepticism, as I said before, about what people get over social media. So this is how much you trust information from news organizations, friends and family, and then social media. Majority saying they don't always trust a lot or some of what they see on social media. But there's an interesting twist to this, which is most people rate themselves pretty high in their ability to tell truth from fiction in social media. They don't really trust that other people can tell truth from fiction on social media. And then that even ties back into what I was saying before about people's unease in the qualifications of their fellow citizens to make informed decisions, because they really think that the effect of social media can be negative. In fact, it's inflated, I think, in people's minds. And this is from a survey in 2016. We haven't updated it more recently, but half of Americans saying they often come across news online that's not fully accurate, and 32% saying they often come across news that's completely made up. Now, there's various big data analytics about the extent of misinformation in social media. It isn't that big, right? I mean, this is a perception people have that this is a fundamentally tainted information stream that they feel they can navigate, but they are not confident everybody else can. And it's sort of in this mix of unease about how our democracies work. So, is there any hope? Because I asked my survey designers this summer, give me something good to end on, because this always sounds like a really sad story. So we just asked people, well, do you think trust in our government can be improved? Do you think our trust in each other can be improved? And we got these overwhelming majorities saying, yes, we think this can get better. So then we just said, well, how? And we let them say as much as they wanted to say. And some people wrote a lot of really interesting things, but I have to say there was no consensus. There's no clear pathway. I think some of the solutions seem a little rosy and pie in the sky. I don't know quite how you're going to get to it, but they touch on a lot of the issues that we talked about here. We just pulled out a few examples: money in politics, leaders need to set an example, they need to create a dialogue, even the role of the media in accentuating our differences is something that people are frustrated with. So this maybe is somewhat of the hopeful slide I always wanted for the end of this. At least people feel there's hope, but I don't know that the public itself has a solution front of mind. So let me end there. And turn it back over to Bobby. And
that was awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. I'm going to just invite the panel up. And if we can just get 5 or 6 minutes response from the panel each, that would be awesome, so that we can get into some questions from you. So first up, if you'd like to kick us off, Sarah, and then we just work down.
Very good. Thank you so much, both for a fantastic and fascinating presentation and for the invitation to be here as well, Bobby. I think that with the perspective from Europe, there's certainly a lot of things that we recognize from the observations and the facts that you've presented here, but I think that also there are some important differences, and I know Paula will elaborate on some of the differences from the UK, but I think if I just point out a couple of things regarding the public opinion trends in Europe that we can observe at the moment, but also I wanted to add a few comments regarding how some of the developments we've seen in public opinion, to my mind, also stem from developments, or in some respects, lack of developments from the institutions that govern us and are not able to respond to the kind of expressions that these voters have voiced in the opinion polls that we see both in the US and here in Europe. So the main differences from these results we see in the US compared to Europe is that, first of all, there's great changes in Europe, across Europe. They're not happening all in the same way, but certainly there's a reaction to two external developments, one of them being the US administration and the fact that Europe is having to find a new role in the world. The US administration certainly has questioned some of the international structures and the global order that we have known for so long. So Europeans are expressing also in the surveys a worry about where the world is going and the place that individual small countries in Europe are facing. And that has meant that there's all of a sudden a greater trust, or at least belief in membership of the European Union, which had been in decline for quite some time. That alongside the developments with Brexit, that public opinion are starting in Europe to see that there is a purpose of the EU membership different to what had been taken for granted in previous years. Security, economic prosperity, political developments, both internally with immigration issues, but also reactions to the external world, have really started to shape the public opinion in Europe. Of course, this is not played out homogeneously across Europe. From the south to the north, there are very great differences, but I'm from Denmark, a country which has been at the same level of Euroscepticism as Britain, and all of a sudden we've become extremely pro-European. We would never leave, and we believe in not necessarily the politicians and the representation, but in the institutions and the purpose and objectives of membership. And those things are translated or voiced also in other countries, the Netherlands, in Central and Eastern European countries, etc., etc. There are many different reasons for being part of EU, for trusting institutions, but certainly the developments with Brexit and the developments in the US have played a very big part in shaping those opinions nationally and at a European level. I think also a very big difference to the US is that our governance structure is quite different in that we are a group of national countries with each our parliamentary presidential systems, but that leads me to my second point. I think that some of the reasons we are seeing the trends that we are, where the divisions we can recognize in Europe, which are also between parties, but certainly much more about identity politics in some countries than we have seen the economic politics have been driving the divides usually. But now we're getting to more about value and identity politics in a range of countries, and that has translated into some identity questions which transcend the usual party lines. There's been written a lot about that, and I think that it's still a question, though, whether parties will catch up with those developments in the electorate and start to realign across those identities or if this is something that translates into different divides altogether in the electorate. But certainly one of the key findings you have about the educational divides is something we very much recognize in many European contexts, which is interesting and different to the income divide. It's no longer about wealth, it's about the level of education and your professional experience as well, which context you live in. So I think that it's important that we continue the conversation and we continue the comparisons between the expressions in public opinion in the US and Europe, but there are very important differences to keep in mind. But as I said, my second point I wanted to highlight here is that some of the work I do and with colleagues just across the road at LSE regarding how accountability mechanisms in political systems are really not in place for the kind of policy making that we have today. Things are fast moving, both from the international level and from the local levels, but we have very old structures and institutions that have not moved a lot in terms of both their capacity and their expertise in addressing, these fast-moving policy agendas. So to give an example, a lot of parliaments have revised their committee structures and sought to become more influential and trying to hold ministers to account when they act both on national policies and international policies and local level, but really they're failing, I have to say. There's very little power from parliaments to actually get ministers to come in and be responsible, be held accountable for the decision-making that has to take place at national level still. Of course, a lot has been moved upwards or downwards in some cases, but those old mechanisms for holding our politicians in place are not respected or not enforced. And I think that this is a very important element to keep in mind when we continue to talk about the kind of representatives that we get, the kind of debate we have, because everything is about the top level and the citizens and how they connect. There's very little focus on what we in political science call the chain of delegation and how each of these levels have a function to play that is not visible to the public, and it's not actually, in many cases, enforceable. And to my mind, it's one of the biggest issues that we have to address when we see, as all of this is played out. I think that I'll stop here, but I'd be very happy to elaborate on this further, but I think that those are my two main points to make here.
Thank you. I'd like to pick up on the presentation and look a little bit at how it chimes and in some places doesn't quite chime with what's going on in politics here in the UK. So I thought I'd start off with the language of polarization. I was very struck by your slide about how different groups speak about each other and the low levels of trust of politicians on the other side. And I think there are here very strong parallels with what's going on in British politics at the moment. The report that's in front of us here and some of the work of Sarah's colleagues at LSE has shown that the Leave-Remain divide operates in a very similar way in the UK. Leave and Remain voters talk about each other in very negative ways, and each side has very low trust in the politicians perceived to be on the other side, and indeed, if we look just over the period since the referendum, we've seen trust declining, particularly actually amongst Remain voters, but that's largely because they had slightly higher trust to begin with, for various reasons. We should be careful, though, not to take this as being about everyone. I've been looking at some recent data from the British election study team, which has a really useful way of asking about Brexit identity. So we've become very used to talking about Remain voters and Leave voters, but not everybody who voted on one side or the other cares that much about it anymore. Some people care very deeply, some people have moved on. And they had this really interesting way of asking about the question that lets people express whether or not they identify very strongly with one side or another. It mirrors the wording of the kind of questions used for partisanship in the US and in the UK. And we find, if we use that measure, that about half of the public have a very strong Brexit identity on one side or the other. The other half only say they have a fairly or not very strong identity. And about 1 in 5 say they've got no Brexit identity at all. So I think we can overstate this in that not absolutely everybody is polarised along these lines, but very much the same kinds of processes happening in terms of, you know, using very obvious psychological tropes about the other side in terms of the way that they are spoken about. But I do have a but to this, in that I don't think that we are quite getting towards the polarisation that you're describing in the US. Because although we've got this Brexit divide and these Brexit identities, they don't explain everything. So it might seem like every question that's thrown at the British public divides along Remain and Leave lines at the moment, but that's largely because they're the questions we're asking the British public. So if you ask them in polling whether there should be a general election, whether Parliament should be prorogued, whether we should revoke Article 50 and so on and so forth, yes, those issues divide very, very strongly along Brexit lines. But there are lots of other political questions that will come up in a general election campaign where the Brexit divide will not help you answer them in the slightest. For example, what should the minimum wage be is not going to get you a set of answers that divide neatly along Leave and Remain lines. In fact, in the UK, we find that those kind of economic issues and the more social issues that connect more closely with Brexit, those two sets of values are barely correlated at all in the UK. Now, whether we're going to see over time them become more correlated so that we end up with the tribes that you have in the US now is an interesting question. I suspect perhaps not, because we've got that more complex party structure which allows other outlets rather than you having to line up with the two parties. So I think we've got a much more complex picture in the UK. We've got weakening party identity rather than strengthening party identity. We've got these new Brexit identities in the mix, and we've got some very unpopular party leaders. And so I prefer to think about British politics as more as fragmentation rather than polarisation at the moment. But as I said, there is still, I think, the potential there over time for those two dimensions which at the moment are largely orthogonal to each other to slowly tilt round until they do line up completely. I think perhaps the hint that might not happen to the same extent as well as our party system is also that economic left-right divide based in class politics has had a much stronger tradition in the UK than it has in the US. The final point that I wanted to make coming out of the presentation that I was really struck by was the point you made about education effects. So this is an area that I've worked on in the UK for quite a long time, trying to understand the education effects we see in our politics. First of all, going back to Brexit, or I'm not sure we ever left it, but linking it to Brexit, if you only have one piece of demographic information about somebody, if you can only know one thing about somebody in order to predict their Leave, whether they were a Leave voter or a Remain voter, knowing whether or not they had a degree is the best piece of information you can have. It's more powerful than age, it's way more powerful than class. It is the most useful piece of information you can have. I could talk more about that, but people can ask later if they're interested. But again, we have a danger, I think, in much as in the US you're at pains to say it's not all about Trump. I also want to say it's not all about Brexit, because actually these education effects have been in our politics for quite a long time. They've just been hiding slightly because their main influence has been on what we think of as third or minor party voting. So if you go back to 2010, the Lib Dems were the first choice party amongst those with degrees in 2010. The best predictor of the share of the UKIP vote at constituency level is the proportion of people in that constituency without formal qualifications. So actually, these education effects have been there for quite some time. As I want to say, Brexit is the symptom rather than the cause. I think actually understanding those education effects in the UK and obviously emerging in the US is one of the most urgent questions for us to address. You will all have heard endless debate about whether or not there was a youthquake in 2017, and we probably could get a number of different opinions on that around the room. But the really big difference in turnout is not between the young and the old, it's between the well-educated, those with degrees, and those without. Turnout amongst young people who didn't go to university in 2017 was below 50%. Many of the issues that we're describing here, trust in government, the role of experts, confidence in our politicians, divide primarily along educational lines. And I think those are one of the most important sets of divides for us to try and grasp in this area.
Well, you've heard a lot, and it's fascinating about what's happening, and you've heard about that with quite a degree of kind of granularity. So I'm going to use my 5 minutes instead to talk about why I think it's happening, and to abandon granularity in favour of enormous brushstrokes. Let me just start with what I think is wrong at the most macro level, because a lot of what we're talking about isn't great, to be honest. At the macro level, I think we have an unbalanced system, and I think the nature of this unbalance varies from country to country, but I think what is common is the kind of lack of balance. So a simple way to understand this is that if we had any psychologists in the room, they would say that psychology probably agrees that human beings have three fundamental needs: autonomy, mastery, and connectedness. And these three needs, I think, exist at a societal level in relation to kind of three domains: the domain of authority, the domain of belonging, and the domain of personal growth, ambition, competition. And I think historically the societies that succeed are the societies that achieve some kind of balance between these kind of forces. The first represented that mastery element, the authority element by the state primarily, the individual aspiration element by the market, and the belonging and connectedness by civil society. And societies that succeed, whether it's the post-war era or the Dutch Golden Age, you can see a kind of dynamic balance of these forces. So at the broadest level, I want to say that most of our countries are unbalanced, and the nature of that unbalance tends to be that individualism, the forces of individualism, the market, the culture of consumerism, etc., are dominant, that belonging is in many ways fractured and problematic as a consequence of aspects of the modern world, and that hierarchy, institutions can't really cope with trying to hold all of this together. And that's a kind of common characteristic, I would say, of many systems, although the nature of this varies from one to the other. So then kind of going down a scale and looking at the particular element of that, which is the institutions, the hierarchical, the authority part of this, which can't hold. And so today we've also had some interesting research published by Mirko Dracker and Carlo Schwartz published by the Social Market Foundation. And they analyse people, and what they're interested in is a group which they call anarchists. And what they meant, it's not really the right term actually, they really mean anti-establishment, but that term's overused. But what they mean really is people who have a predisposition not really to trust institutions and authority. And this is a much larger group than you might imagine, and for some time it's been around kind of 40% of the population have this predisposition not to trust authority and not to trust institutions. The things that have changed about it recently is that it has grown, and it's grown from not that much, but it's grown, and secondly it's become more right-wing. That is to say, it used to be that anti-establishmentarianism was more left-wing than right-wing, but now it's more right-wing than left-wing. Now, why has this happened? I think it's happened because of the failure of institutions. And we've heard about that was part of Sarah's account, I think, is the failure of institutions. But it's also happened because of other things: globalization, economic failure and inequality, social media we've talked about a little bit. So you've got these factors roiling around and institutions unable to respond to that, and you have a macro system in which the forces of individualism are rampant and the forces of belonging or solidarity or togetherness are fractured. Now, the new element in all of this, however, is anti-establishment politics. Now, it's not entirely new. Often in the past, Republicans, Ronald Reagan did it, will argue that they are somehow against the system. But even so, they kind of knew they were going to be in that system eventually. So it was a kind of muted anti-establishmentarianism. But that's not what we've got now. We've got a full-throated anti-establishmentarianism from within the establishment, as it were. And that's what you see in populism. What it is fundamentally is a politics that says the establishment is rotten, and even when I become part of the establishment, I won't be part of the establishment. I'll still be on your side, and I'll still be smashing the rotten establishment. Where does this end up? I think it ends up in one of two ways. It either ends up in the dominance of populist governance, and in many ways that looks like where we are, that we've had three great periods since the Second World War: the post-war settlement, neoliberalism, and now populist governance. And this is the third era that we're now in. And maybe that's right. And populist governance will vary, and there'll be relatively benign forms like Boris Johnson might represent, and there'll be much more malign versions like Orban or Putin or whatever. But we'll see populist governance institutionalized in various ways. The alternative is that we see a renewal of those institutions that we've talked about, that we do see the kinds of things we need, greater use of deliberative democracy, greater devolution of power, new ways of thinking about government, new models of government. My warning, however, is this. I think it's very hard for institutions to renew in a very unbalanced system. So actually, I would argue, and whether this might fill you with revolutionary hope or utter despair, because it's a very grand proposition, but we're only going to recreate the balance where not only do we have institutional renewal, but we also attend to the way in which belonging has been fractured and find new ways of belonging, new forms of tribalism, which are benign, and we think about taming individualism. And this is very urgent in terms of climate change in particular. Models of individualism that are to do with growth and self-development, not to do with consumerism and acquisition. So we're going to we need a new settlement. Institutional renewal is part of that, but it can only be part of the solution.
Awesome. Thank you so much to our panel. I'm going to jump as quickly as possible into questions because we're a little pushed for time. So hands up if you've got a question to ask. If you can say who you are, where you're from. Try and take 2 or 3 at a time, depending on how we get on. There's a fellow there. There's one here. Please. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Dan James. I'm originally from Canada, but I've been in the UK for about 14 years now. My question is to everyone, but touches a lot on some of the issues the last speaker raised. Around some of the rise of populist governments, and not just within Europe, whether it's Orban, Salvini, Le Pen, but elsewhere, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Xi Jinping, etc. And it feels like it's no longer, the divide that everyone sort of spoke about isn't about left and right in terms of, do we want to tax corporations more or less? Do we want to have more social institutions or less? But it feels like it's the Western liberal order that we've seen for the last 60 years versus the authoritarian strongman. And it feels to me like somebody on the first half of that argument, to be clear, that it's getting worse. And the fear that I have is that can it get better without it getting much worse first? Or are we headed for a real crash and a real nasty revolution of populism before we can start to restore faith in Western liberal democracy?
Great. Thank you very much. And here.
Hi, my name is Alessia, and I'm Italian, and I studied here at King's.
Yep.
And I was just wondering why having a degree is actually better than looking at economic and class of someone to understand what they will vote, given that, especially in the US, having a degree is super expensive, and even in the UK, it's public, but different kind of public than in other European countries.
Great. So keep your hands up if you've got things, but maybe if we Paula, do you want to kick off on the degree thing, and then maybe Mike, from your perspective, US perspective, and then we'll pick the
Yes.
question about trajectory.
So the degree, non-degree divide it actually connects the two questions together, because what it does is, in terms of values, it's really strongly connected to that set of values on the kind of liberal authoritarian scale, dimension, whatever we want to call it. So actually what you see in the Brexit vote, for example, is that how you felt about a completely unconnected issue like the death penalty is actually quite a good predictor of how you voted in the referendum, because both of those things are connected deeper down to something to do with education. I have written more about that, about what it is about education that actually drives that liberalising force, but we'll perhaps pick that up afterwards. But it is that connection between these structural divides and our value system that starts to drive this forward. And it's that movement from the left-right divide, which connects primarily to money, income and wealth, and the liberal authoritarian divide, which connects much more strongly to education.
Mike, any to add from a US perspective?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we're seeing in the US, even around education, is that it's been wrapped into a lot of this cultural tension over both how education is a part of these culture wars itself. A view that universities are taking a side in these battlegrounds over political correctness. Let's just use that as an umbrella term for this broader area about stresses around diversity and inclusion versus more traditional cultures. But then also that universities are part of the, quote, rigged system, along with the markets and along with the government that is sort of replicating advantage for some to the exclusion of others. And so the whole symbolism around education, aside even from whether somebody is or isn't a college grad, has taken on this really explosive meaning in the US, even just over the last 5 years. So, one of the findings that we've been talking about a lot in the US lately is the perception of universities has become, on balance, negative in the US among Republicans. So we asked this broad question, do you think each of these is good or bad for the well-being of our country? And we asked about government, we asked about all sorts of different institutions, and a majority of Republicans now say that colleges and universities do more harm than good to America overall, which is a pretty stunning statement if you think about the impact of universities, particularly if you worked at one. But it's tapping into this, and it's not that people don't see that, education can help economically. Those Republicans who went to college still think it was beneficial for them. They still want their children to go to college, but there's this deeper sense that the role universities are playing is both a replication of inequality, a replication of advantage differentials, exacerbating those differentials, as well as sort of taking a side in the identity of our nation in a way that people are uncomfortable with.
Right. So, does it need to get worse before it can get better, anyone?
Yeah, so if you go back to that periodization, the end of the post-war settlement was to do with the internal contradictions of that system and an external shock. And the external shock was the oil crisis and associated kind of economic slump, the moment when neoliberalism, which continues as a zombie system, but the moment at which it loses people's hearts and minds is a global financial crisis, but it also is weighed down by its own contradictions. So that's where we are. Populism has its own internal contradictions, which will surface in various ways. The question is, what are the external shocks? And will they lead us to kind of purgatory, or will they lead us to renewal? And I think the two issues are absolutely the critical existential questions that will determine this are technology and climate change. So are technology and climate change factors which make things worse, because they could make things worse in many ways, destabilize things further, drive greater inequality, greater conflict? Or are they moments at which we recognize that the system that we've got is failing and that we need to completely renew it, and we have the scale of imagination and we create the kind of Overton window where new types of leadership, new types of politics kind of merge? And, I'm kind of, I don't know, in some ways I'm hopeful that the tech backlash is in full spate now, and, that's interesting, because a few years ago there was very little resistance to a kind of technological determinism about the world, and we have seen recently, of course, an upsurge in climate activism and a raising of public awareness, even in the States. So technology and climate change, I think, are the big things that will determine whether things get better or worse. And you know, actually, the fact of the matter is we just need to get involved.
Anyone else? Yeah.
I think I'd like to just make one point, which is that we need to be very careful with dedicating too much of the importance to the educational system and the grades that people have in order to predict or determine whether they are actual liberal or in favor of authoritarianism, because certainly, first of all, we see big differences between the divides that we're talking about here in the UK compared to...
They can't hear at the back, by the way, they're waving at us.
Can you hear me? Compared to what the experience looks like in, let's say, Hungary. I mean, there are very big differences between the kind of liberal values that we are distinguishing between in a political system such as the UK, or even compared to Italy or other places in Europe. So I just wanted to make that very clear, that just because you get a university degree doesn't mean that your political profile has been branded to your back and you will never change your mind. In fact, many of these developments and expressions are really not so much about these determinants, but rather the ones that we don't see. So the fact that people are not feeling represented and are not voting for the mainstream parties is not because of their educational degrees necessarily, but because they have an experience of not being part of this system. And that, of course, may go back to their educational degrees, but rather it's about their experience right now, that they don't have the opportunities, and the system is not working for them in the experience that they have. And I think that that's really important for us to keep in mind, and I know that this is what is really also stressed in the Divided Britain work that has been done here. Education is a factor that may explain certain things, but it is, of course, also the socio-economic experiences that people have that really bring this back to the divides that has been laid out.
Great, thank you. So we've got one in the middle that's already got the mic, and then where's the other mic? Oh, it's there. Oh, God, we've already got two. So it is 7:41, so we need to run through these questions and then maybe try and get one more round in. So quick, no statements, questions.
Be as quick as I can. Given I know it's a very turbulent time at the moment with politics, but I find following it almost a full-time job. And I say, is it realistic for us to expect the electorate to be informed in elections?
Yeah. And in the middle, yep.
Mary Dejevsky, I'm a journalist. I've got one question for Michael Dimmock. Your very first slide showed a sort of spike in the otherwise declining level of trust around, I couldn't make out, it was somewhere around 2001, 2002. Yeah. And I wondered why, because you've got the Tide election, you've got...
It was 9/11.
Sorry?
Yeah, it was right after the 9/11 attacks.
That increased trust rather than...
there was a huge unification of trust behind a lot of institutions that went beyond government.
And a short question for Paula Surridge. I know that we've heard all the caveats about education, but looking specifically at the UK, do you think things might change given the change in the numbers of people who are now getting degrees and the nature of those degrees, whether education and higher education will continue to be, if you like, such a predictor?
Great. So, Paul, again, take that specific, then others can come back on the expectations of being informed. Yeah.
Expectations?
No, you take the education.
So the education one, obviously there's a long way for that to play out, so it's difficult to say what's going to happen with that in the future. The only thing I can say is that I looked at this in terms of education generation, so whether you got your degree when it was very uncommon and so on, and there's no obvious pattern to that, there's no obvious sense of that changing. But obviously there may be a tipping point to that we haven't quite reached yet.
Great. And expectations for everyone to be perfectly informed.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea that people feel overwhelmed with the volume and pace of information is absolutely true, and we pick that up in the questions we ask people about it. We ask people if they feel exhausted when they're following the news, and they say yes, and that's more so than in the past. So I think it's a part of the frustration with a lot of it that people feel that it's hard to keep up with what's going on, and then, I think the problem is that in that environment, we tend to just psychologically fall back on those sort of easy cues and shortcuts, which can often lead to even more reinforcing of, if things are moving really too fast, well, what is my side saying? What is the other side? Like you just end up back in that space. And I think it's not just that, say, social media. There's a lot of talk about how the new online social media environment is sort of creating these, filter bubbles, these environments where we only hear from people we agree with. It's not even just that. I think our research has found in the US that, most people, it's almost hard not to run into a wide variety of information. So relatively few people truly live in that kind of cone of only Democratic or Republican information. But their willingness to just reject, and accept and filter that information through those kind of signals is probably higher, given the exhaustion that they're expressing.
I mean, I think it's partly about how you read what's going on, and one of the ways I read it is it's like the reverse of the First World War. So the First World War, so many people died because the weapons of defence were so much more sophisticated than the weapons of attack, right? Fixed machine guns and barbed wire, which is much more effective than rifles. Now, we've got the reverse now, which is the politics of attack, the politics, the irresponsible politics, if you like, to be emotive about it, is just much more effective and powerful than more responsible defending the establishment politics. And that's a really big part of this, the technology of populism. And the technology, and so you see that now. I mean, in my view, the whole no deal for Argo is the biggest exercise in political misdirection we've ever seen. And we've just all fallen for it. It's incredible. So, I think when we read all this, we need to read it understanding that there's this kind of imbalance of power playing out, and that one side's really got the best tunes nearly all the time.
Great. So this is, I'm afraid, the final round for people, so we can take a couple more. Apologies to those who can't get it in, but it's 8:44 on my clock. So yes, we've got one there. And can you make it to the back? We should do one at the back. So yes, you go ahead.
Hi, I'm Monique. I'm Dutch, but I've been living in the UK for about 30 years. I completely agree about inequality being at the base of a lot of this, but what would you say as the panel that whether two-party politics versus more proportional consensual politics plays a part in this, looking at the US and the UK versus the EU?
Yeah, great question. And did we find someone at the back? Yes.
Hi, my name's Becky. I come from the perspective, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
I come from the perspective that fixing this polarisation is really important, and I think a lot of us probably do. So, Matthew, you talked about engendering belonging as part of this. Do you think that's the responsibility of governments or non-state actors, and how do you think that could be done? How would we go about doing that?
Great. Two brilliant questions. Can I also ask any sort of final reflections from the panel? This is our last round. Do you want to start there and then come back to Mike?
Yeah, I'll just make one very brief point, which is in this excellent report, one of the points that Bobby and his colleagues make is that politicians do make choices. And they make choices about whether or not their rhetoric and their actions divide us or not. And I think it's not just politicians make those choices. I think all sorts of institutions and organisations make those choices. So, this belonging question, it's a different seminar, it's a different conversation. But certainly, one of the things that's going on, and it goes back to my point about attack and defence in a way, really, is that too many people are careless about the way in which their articulation of issues, and this isn't just politicians, is undermining our capacity for solidarity and togetherness rather than bringing it together. And there are exceptions, and at that you need to kind of look at the particular way in which people express things and the impact that it has. And maybe one of the things we have to do as a country is to become more attuned to that, more able to recognise and to judge when it looks as though people are doing things which worsen divides rather than bring us together.
Thank you, Matthew. Paul.
Where to start with that one? So starting with the two-party politics, I think actually in some respects, because the issue that is polarising us in the UK cuts across our two-party politics, that is actually helping to keep that polarisation reined in a little bit at the moment. But there is definitely the danger there that either or both of those two main parties could go completely along one line, and that could actually force the polarisation to become much more like what we see in the US. It kind of speaks to a need for stronger third and fourth parties to stop that polarisation becoming complete.
So I think my answer is perhaps a bit predictable coming from Denmark and having a bit of the same experience as the Dutch. But certainly if you look at any of the multi-party systems in Europe, you don't have the same degree of what we call conflict politics, which is played out in the UK. And on the continent, we have consensus politics. It might be that you have a majority government that can run the show, but it still has to reach out for future position-making and collaboration with other parties across the aisle, or in the other direction to the more extreme. But there is a culture of consensus building, especially when it comes to big national interests. So the example of Brexit is one that I use in my teaching about these things, because the electoral system has a lot to answer for in the UK when it comes to inequality, but also Brexit. Theresa May's decision to make it her deal and to make it her agreement is very different to how any other country has dealt with a no in a referendum previously. Ireland, Netherlands, France, Denmark. We've all had referendum that also were of a great significance, and the first thing each government did was to say, how do we handle this as a parliament? Not as an individual politician or as a government, but there had to be cross-bench consensus building along when it comes to such big issues. And I think that, to my mind, this is one of the key issues that we're still grappling with Brexit in these times, but also for other big issues for the UK.
The EU did was override.
Override, sorry.
We can pick that up afterwards.
I'm happy to elaborate on that previously, but that was not an EU. That was another referendum on the basis of recommendations from Parliament across the aisle.
Mike.
Oh, there's no question that the sort of two-party nature of American politics is a unique feature in all this, and that there's not really an outlet from that. And there's a big conversation about why we can't have a successful third party in the US. Some of it is just the structure of the elections, first past the post all the way up to directly elected president. Part of it is that there's no real consolidation in the center around a unique dimension that really fosters a different angle in the American political debate today. But there's one little part, your point, Matthew, about the rhetoric of politicians that I think is really important, and it's another angle of social media I thought I could leave you with. One of the factors in social media is that the feedback loop to political leaders has fundamentally changed with this. It used to be that a member of Congress in the US would be worried about what would appear in the newspaper in their local town the next day, because that's what their constituents would hear about them. So whether consciously or subconsciously, they would be thinking about their rhetoric and tone through the lens of how's this going to play with my voters through that venue. Now the feedback loop is almost immediate, because a lot of it's happening through social media, right? They're tweeting, they're getting feedback on that tweet really, really quickly. And what we found, we did a really deep analysis of all of the tweets coming out of the US Congress, which ones were getting a lot of likes and upvotes and positive reinforcement, and they were the most virulent, attacking, negative ones. That's the feedback loop if you're a member of Congress. The harsher your language, the more thumbs ups you get, right? And it's hard for that to not have an effect on you psychologically. That's the sort of feedback loop that's been created here. So I think that's another element of social media, aside from just what's happening at the public level. When we do presentations with political leaders, their feeling is they're just responding to what their constituents are asking them for out of that sense of communication. Now, again, they're only hearing from a very small slice of their electorates, but it's a big factor in the messaging that's coming out of Washington, at least in the US.
Great. Thank you for that, Mike. Hoped we'd end on a more optimistic note, but it is hard in this subject. So before I do thank yous, just to say copies of this report, which Policy Institute did with for Engage Britain, which is a great new organisation looking at how do we bring people together more, which is not the definitive view, obviously, in these types of issues, but hopefully is a useful primer for lots of people on what the polarisation and fragmentation trends are. We do have copies of this next door for drinks, whether that's a bribe to stay or a reason to run away if you've had enough of this tonight. Do have a look if you can pick one up. So just left for me to say thank you to Policy Institute team who organised this, for you and for those great questions, and finally to our excellent panel and Mike Dimmock.
Thank you.
Great stuff. Yeah. Good. Nice. Good job. Yeah. Thank you.